Thanks so much, Nick, and appreciate you making some time to be with me this morning. So I was particularly excited to speak with you because the nature of interviews with experts is speaking with people who have successfully built companies, in many cases multiple companies, through leveraging their personal brands and doing that using content. So books, podcasts, blogs, live events. And obviously you are one of the marketing experts of the entrepreneurial world, and so it's intriguing to me to hear where you kind of started out versus where you are now, and how you've kind of created the amount of leverage you do. And can we start first of all, just for the audiences listening who don't necessarily are not already part of the group, just to introduce, who you are, what you do, and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, sure. So Nick James, creator of Expert Empires, also co-founder of another company called the Elite Closing Academy. We effectively provide training, mentoring, coaching for experts. Anyone who's running a business as a coach, a consultant, a speaker, a trainer, an author, an agency, that kind of business owner. And I guess I'm best known for the Expert Empires events, where we've had well-known speakers like Gary Vaynerchuk and Cardone, David Goggins, many others. But right now, of course, we are not running big live events for the time being. And so really, I suppose our main kind of focus and what we're committed to is the growth and world-class delivery of our mastermind programs.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, I think in the time we're in now, there's uncertainty for a lot of people, but my observation seems to be that the business world in particular is fairly polarised, and so you've got people who are sadly really struggling, and then you also seem to have businesses that are, in the opposite way, really thriving, actually.
Yeah, I mean, let me comment on that though. I think my opinion, for what it's worth, is that there are some businesses that were very unlucky and couldn't have really done much about the restrictions that have been imposed on them. They were effectively in the wrong industry at the wrong time. Bad luck. Then there's a bunch of businesses that were in the right industry at the right time, and they've grown through just potluck, nothing more than that. But I think that both those extremes are actually quite rare. The vast majority of us sit smack bang in the middle, which means you make your own luck, basically. Like, you could either, when lockdown happened, you could either have a pity party and go, oh, my business is screwed, it's not my fault, and kind of feel sorry for yourself. Or you could go, look, this isn't ideal, what can I do about it? And get resourceful. And I think there are loads of examples of people in that category that got resourceful and businesses have thrived over the last 6-8 months. There are also loads of examples, probably more, although you don't see that much of them, of course, where their businesses have suffered massively. But I know this sounds harsh, but probably the reason they've suffered is less bad luck and more bad attitude than anything. That sounds harsh, probably, but that's my personal opinion, for what it's worth.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think there are some people that might hear that and be really adamant that it's not. It's the climate, it's external factors. But the reality remains that there is a recession roughly every 10 years. That there are ups and downs. There are things that happen that we can't control or predict. And what's happened in 2020, I think, certainly counts as an example of that.
And the question really is, what can't you control and what can you control? And focus on what you can control, because if you can't control it, it's almost not, I know it sounds extreme, it's almost not worth the time, the energy to put any focus, attention on it whatsoever.
Yeah, I completely agree, because what can you physically do about it? And I think a more constructive question is, looking at the things that you can help and you can make sort of, progress in. You're better off focusing in those areas. And you definitely practice what you preach, because, since the lockdown, amongst quite a few things you're working on from what I can gather. You particularly have launched your podcast fairly recently. So you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, this is a time when, this is an opportunity for you to step up and be more visible to people who might be needing help in the areas that you support in.
Well, and also visible in different ways as well. So, like traditionally, how I do visibility, if you want to call it that, is through live events and through marketing and selling tickets to our Expert Empires events. Now, I cannot control the fact that we are currently not allowed to run live events of more than 30 people. So I can't do Expert Empires with 500 to 1,000 people 3 times a year. I can't do that right now. So what can I do? Well, what I figured was I can, regardless of what the restrictions are on live, I can launch a podcast, which, by the way, is something I've been meaning to do for ages. And so in some respects, I know none of us would have chosen this global crisis to be thrust upon us. I don't know, maybe if you're Amazon, you might privately disagree with that statement, but the majority of us would not have chosen this. I certainly wouldn't have. But you got to ask yourself, well, there's a load of things I can't do now through no fault of my own, but what can I do? And I went, well, I can finally get round to launching my podcast. And actually, if I'd have known how relatively easy and successful it was going to be, in other words, the result we got relative to the amount of time, effort and money that was invested was disproportionately high, I was like, if I'd have known it was that good, I would have done it sooner. So in some respects, this crisis has been a gift because it's caused me to do things differently that I wouldn't have been forced to do before. And now I've discovered new, different, in some cases, better ways to grow the brand and grow the business.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So you didn't sort of feel any of the sort of restrictions you do hear from some people, like, you didn't say, well, I specialise in live events. And I've been to a couple of your events, actually, like, ones that you've organised, I've seen you speak, and they're very well thought out, they're well planned, they're well put together. It's fair to say that you're an expert in putting on live events. And so with that taken away from you, like you say, you just kind of shifted your focus. What were some of the kind of the learnings been from doing the podcast, and given that it at the time felt like a bit of a new thing to you, and it was potentially a big step in a new direction?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's worth just mentioning that for those that don't know and might think, oh, that seems fairly easy, you can't do live events, you just stop doing live events, you start doing something else. It wasn't that easy. We had an event scheduled for the end of March and had to postpone it less than 3 days out. And we'd sold over 500 tickets for that event. That was an absolute disaster for us. We had clients, customers complaining, we had people slating me on social media, we had all sorts of problems. Because initially I was going to go ahead with the event, and then the restrictions came in, and then I decided not to, and basically I realised that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You can't win, really. You can't please all the people all the time. And so that was really, really hard. One of those days towards the end of March, I had what I still call to this day my worst ever day in business. Like literally 100 plus people on social media publicly slating me. I'm like, that is not nice. I don't care how thick your skin has become, that is not nice, and that does hurt. And I went, right, what am I going to do about this? And so we had to come up with a way to ensure that those people were served, looked after, they got value for the money they'd invested. We ran the event online at 36 hours notice, which wasn't easy. The team did an amazing job of pulling that off with very little technical equipment or expertise. So we had to make it work. But then to answer your question, since then, what I've learned from doing the podcast in particular, that's one of the many things that we've kind of switched into over the last 6 months or so. I think there's a few things. One, I immediately when I decided to do the podcast, there were areas I knew that I was aware In other words, I knew that I didn't know what I was doing. So I sought out people that did. So, you know, I got a shout out. Rob Moore, great friend of mine, gave me way more support, advice, guidance than was probably ever reasonable for me to ask for. And also, you know, we didn't have the resource in-house to really produce a podcast at the standard or the level that I wanted to. So I involved Rob's agency actually to do all the production, because I knew that the biggest restricting factor or the biggest limiter really for me getting the podcast up and running was the time it was going to take. You know, there's almost zero cost of doing it. It was time. So for me, I went, right, I'm going to schedule time out in my diary to record the episodes and schedule the interviews and things like that. But the additional time resource it's going to take to produce and edit and publish and all that stuff, I outsourced it completely to Rob's agency, and that made it a lot easier. So I think the first thing is, when you're switching into something that you're not already experienced in or at, finding somebody else to support you on that knows what they're doing is smart, for sure. And then actually in our case, we really just did what we already knew worked. We modelled the exact method that we use for launching tickets to our events that have worked. You know, we've sold thousands and thousands of tickets to live events over the years. I don't know if you lost me there, by the way. I can't hear Georgia, so I'm just going to keep talking and assume that the recording's working.
Yeah, I think it cut out.
Alright, where did you lose me? You can edit me back in. What was I talking about?
You're talking about Rob Moore gave you a shout out and you sought out help from where you needed it.
Yeah. And then the second thing is that we actually fell back on or utilised a lot of the strategies, tactics that we already knew worked. So the launch method, if you like, that I used to get the podcast to number one on Apple, on iTunes, and also generate over a couple of £100,000 in new sales, was really the exact same strategy that we use to sell thousands of tickets a year to expert empires, just adapted or mapped across. So I think often we're looking for, I see this a lot in our industry, people are looking for the new way, the shiny object, the new fad that will get them the result. And actually, a lot of times I believe that success in business is finding what works and then rinsing and repeating and doing it again. And so we already had a launch strategy for tickets to our events that we knew worked. So we were like, well, we know this works to sell thousands of tickets to events a year. So how can we use it to get thousands of podcast subscribers at once? So we effectively just used the exact same strategy and then just tweaked what we already knew worked, rather than trying to start with a blank sheet of paper or a blank slate or a clean slate and go, what do we do here? So yeah, that was what the approach I took with the podcast was, one, learn from people that are already masters at it, someone like Rob, and then two, fall back and utilise what we already know works and then map those strategies across to the new way of doing things.
To be honest, I think that's invaluable in terms of advice for people listening who haven't necessarily taken that step and got some kind of form of powerful content out there, because like you say, there's no need to actually reinvent the wheel. And I think sometimes that's a temptation, isn't it? With content marketing in particular, there's a panic because it's kind of a vague field. So it's like, what are these like secret content marketing strategies that I don't know about that somebody somewhere knows that I'll go and search for, or like I shouldn't do this until I've got this really succinct plan together to market it. But actually, like you say, you can ask people who do know, and you don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel with strategy-wise with what you're doing if you've already got something that's worked for something else.
Yeah, and I think when people are trying to build their personal brand via content, they make it hard for themselves, And a lot of the times, the reason they make it hard for themselves is they've got a belief which says, I've only got a certain number of content pieces to share, and I'm going to run out of things to say really quickly. And maybe I'll launch a podcast and I'll get 5 episodes in, and then I won't have anything fresh. And by the way, podcast is one example. It's the same if they're writing a book, or it's the same if they're running an event, or whatever they seem to be doing. And I think what people don't realise is, look at some of the greatest content marketers on the planet. People who I've been fortunate to work with, like Gary Vee, like Cardone, these kind of guys and girls who are hugely successful, well known. I'll tell you, they do not have more than probably 5 or 10 pieces of content. They're just finding new ways to say the same thing differently. I actually don't have more than, I suppose, probably maybe 10, 15 big chunks of content. And then, of course, there's lots of detailed tactical stuff that sits below. But there's so many different ways you can present that content. First of all, the platform you use to deliver it, whether it's over Facebook Live, or whether it's through a podcast, or whether it's in the written word, whether it's at live events. There's loads of different online events like webinars, loads of different ways to present the same thing. But also there's loads of different ways to frame and package the same thing. So, when I'm recording content, as I suppose we are here, I'm recording this podcast interview with you for your show, but also I'm streaming this live in my Facebook community because I might say something vaguely interesting they haven't heard before in this 20 or 30 minute interview. So I figure you might as well capture it. I'm spending the time anyway, so my thought process is, how many different ways can I leverage this 20 or 30 minute interview if I'm going to do it anyway? So I think repurposing of content is key, but also there's so many different ways you can come up with content ideas where people, this is where I think people go, I'm going to run out of titles to have for my podcast episode. It's like, well, if you have interviewing others, like that's the main focus for your podcast, Georgia, but so I do some interviews, some content pieces of my own. So I'll do interviews with like celebrity speakers, but I'll also do interviews with my most successful clients. And I'll then do my own content pieces. And sometimes I'll go, right, I need a new idea for a content piece. I'll look back through my notes of all the questions that my clients have asked me in mastermind meetings or on private coaching calls over the last month. And I've got probably 20, 30 different content ideas at any given time. So it's one of those that actually the more work you do, whether that's the more people you meet, the more sales calls you have, the more clients you coach, the more mastermind meetings in my case that you host, the more opportunity you've got to come up with content ideas. And I'm never ever now going to run out of ideas for podcast episodes, because I've got so many people around me that are worthwhile asking questions to. I've got so many people around me that are asking me questions frequently, so I just keep note of all that, and then whenever it comes to, I've normally got a load of ideas already, but if I ever come to record a podcast interview or episode and I go, I haven't got anything for today, I literally just look through my notes about all the questions that I've been asked recently, and I go, boom, that'd make a great episode, and off I go.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's amazingly simple to come up with really valuable topics as well. This isn't just any old thing that you can think of, but like you say, this is like basing your content around questions that real people are asking you on a regular basis.
Well, and in my case, my ideal client, I'm like, if somebody in my mastermind is asking me this question and saying this is really critical for my business, what that says is that question or that issue is significant to other people who are my ideal client. Whereas if I'm just coming up with what I think people want to learn or hear about, then I might miss the mark, I might be wrong. Whereas if I'm basing it on what my audience is telling me, then I can't miss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this it all goes back to one of the sort of most fundamental principles of content creation, because the term content creation is a bit of a buzzword in itself, isn't it? And I think it can become a bit, the meaning of it gets a bit lost, but ultimately it's value creation. It's the same sort of a thing, right? So as long as you're focused on the people you're actually serving, and doing something that's meaningful to them, that's what's the most important thing, rather than what you think sounds good or what you think you should be doing.
Always, and that comes back to how I created the concepts for my early live events. Were all based upon asking my audience, asking the community what they wanted, rather than what I've learned over the years. If I've learned one thing over the years, it's that actually my opinion counts for very little, and the opinion of the people who are my ideal client, my target market, is really the only one that matters.
Something that you mentioned earlier in the show, and we will be wrapping up in the next few minutes anyway, but you mentioned that the podcast is, of course, just one of the many new initiatives that you've taken on since the lockdown began in the last 6 months. So could you give everybody an insight into what else that you're working on behind the scenes or otherwise?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot. Here are the key things that we've done since, I guess, the end of March, when lockdown started. So first thing I did on the 1st of April, once the all the cleanup had been done on the having to postpone the live Expert Empires event, which was a fair old bit of cleanup. But on the 1st of April, we started really running online events live. I always avoid using the term webinar whenever I market or promote these, because I look at, I knew at that point in time that there was going to be a flooding of the marketplace with webinars, and generally speaking, I've kind of surveyed my audience, and the beliefs that people have around webinars and what they expect from a webinar aren't all that helpful. So I hear things like, when somebody sees a webinar advertised, they think it's going to be just a pitch, and it's probably going to be low amounts of actionable content, and really it's all positioning for the speaker. These are some of the things that I hear. So when we went into lockdown and I realised we're going to have to do webinars, but the best move I thought we could make was to not call them webinars. So I've used a couple of different frames. We've called them online strategy sessions, we've called them online masterclasses, online mastermind sessions, things like this, which generally speaking have higher perceived value. So a mastermind in general, most masterminds to enroll in, they're generally in person, small numbers, high value, high fee. So you're normally in the multiple thousands of pounds to enroll in a mastermind. So by positioning our online events as online masterminds, I feel like it raised the perceived value, and that ended up being true. And so the registrations, attendance rates, sales results from those sessions were far greater than what I would have previously expected. So that certainly worked, to do some events online but differentiate them from all the other webinars that are out there. So instead of making them like an hour, we made our first online sessions 3 hours. And instead of the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes being fluff and filler and life story, I promised in the marketing, this starts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We did different times. Everyone seems to do 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. I went, we'll do it in the afternoon. Just try and stand out and be different. So we did 3 o'clock in the afternoon. My promise was at 3:01, I'll be into content training, teaching you stuff that's going to be highly valuable for you. There won't be any fluff, filler, life story, any of that stuff. It's straight in. And we did. I also said in advance, by the way, you might be wondering if this is just going to be a big pitch for one of my products or services or masterminds. And so here's exactly what's going to happen. It's 3 hours worth of valuable training. I'm going to take 10 minutes in the middle to tell you about Mastermind. If you're interested, great. If you're not, you can go make a cup of tea or do whatever you want to do. And the feedback I got was that people hadn't really seen marketing of that kind of event, like a webinar, that transparently before. And I think that brought us a lot of goodwill. So we attracted large numbers of people onto our events online, which was great. But that's really paid dividends over the last 6 months, because I feel like we've built up an enormous amount of goodwill and trust with our community. And so, sales of our mastermind programs have been, believe it or not, it's crazy to think this, higher than they were when we were running Expert Empires events. So we've sold more mastermind places without doing big live events than we used to. And by the way, those big live events were my primary source of clients beforehand. So we've effectively replaced it with a different model. So webinars that we don't call webinars was one. The podcast launch, which we've already talked about, was another. And more recently, and I think this is worth mentioning as well, because look, I am still, regardless of what happens in the world, with the restrictions and so on with COVID, I love meeting people in person, face to face, and so I feel like a lot of people in our industry have pulled back from live events completely and just doing all online. There's nothing wrong with that, but I feel like at the moment there's a gap that's not being filled, and I am filling it, called you can come to our live events. Now, we can't have 500 or 1,000 people, but I can have 8, 10, 12 in my training centre around the boardroom, socially distanced, and give people a live experience and meet them personally. So we're doing those kind of events regularly. We're planning to do 15 of those in the last 3 months of the year. And we're finding that people are travelling from all over the country. They're loving them. It means they can we're fortunate that we've actually got our own training centre that, without social distancing restrictions, seats up to 100 people anyway. So I don't need to be reliant upon, I'm hearing horror stories from other people in our industry about hotels where they've got an event booked and now they're cancelling it because of the new guidelines and all that kind of stuff. I'm going, look, we can still run events, small numbers, socially distanced, around a boardroom table, or we can have up to 30 in our training centre comfortably with loads of space, and we've got all the we're taking lots of precautions and measures for people's health and safety. I feel like there's a real desire for that in the market right now, because there's such a lack of live events. And actually, before lockdown, the live events market was, dare I say, like saturated. There was free events happening all the time. 2-day, 3-day events happening all the time every weekend on how to grow your business, how to use marketing tactics, how to invest in property, all this stuff. And there's so much noise. And now all of a sudden it's like dead quiet on the live events front. And so for me, running live events in a climate where barely anybody else is, and doing it, fortunately we've got the training facility of our own at our office, and we can be in control of the environment, whereas if you're using an external venue or supplier, then you can't be. You're effectively, if they choose to close down, nothing you can do about it. We talked earlier about what can you control, what can't you control. I suppose the 3 big things that we've done in the last 6 months that have, in terms of delivering our content and creating opportunities to enroll clients from that, are online webinars that I do not call webinars, and I do everything I can possibly do to differentiate them from the crowd. The second thing was the podcast launch, which has been extremely successful. And then the third thing is small number in-person live events.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's like the common theme is kind of like, how can you do, it's sort of like what's going to have the greatest impact, but also putting your own spin on it to make it kind of unique without, always focused on who it's really created for. What
I'm always thinking, Georgia, is look at, I know it's cliche, but it's generally cliches are cliches because they're true. Like, I like to observe the masses in our market or our industry and try and do the opposite. And I'm going, like, the reason I created Expert Empires was everyone was doing these free events that the market kind of got wise to, which is you turn up for a free event, probably because you want to see the headline speaker, but you end up having to sit through a load of sales pitches beforehand. And so I went, right, let's mix this up a little bit. Let's bring over like the best speakers in the world who are, well known and highly regarded and very expensive. People like Gary Vaynerchuk and Grant Cardone and David Goggins and Tom Bilyeu and loads of others that we've had. Let's bring them over, but let's not pack them around. Let's not pack the event full of other pitches. Let's charge for the ticket so I don't have to, and then tell people, by the way, the reason this event costs anything between 100 and 1,000 quid to attend is because we're not just going to hard sell you loads of stuff from the stage at this event. You're going to learn from people like our headline speakers, people like me, who've been in this industry quite a long time, and other guests, most of whom have nothing to sell to you at all. And that was quite disruptive, I felt, in the industry. A lot of people told me it wouldn't work, and that you can't compete with free, was what I was told. And I went, well, watch me. And so what I've observed over the last few years that we've been running those events is the numbers attending free events gradually drop, and the show rates go down to, in some cases, single digit percentages, sometimes less than 10% of people that register for a free event actually turn up. And I've seen the numbers in our events go up and up, and these are paid tickets. And the reason for that is people attend once and they come back because they had such a great experience, and they don't mind putting their hand in their pocket to buy a ticket when it's good value. So I think, my final thought here would be, when you're looking at how to grow your expert business or how to deliver your content over the next 3 to 6 months in a way that's going to get noticed, just look at what everyone else is doing and do the opposite. Like, if there's a trend in your market, like there was in mine, of free events, I went the opposite, I went paid. When there was a trend of 60-minute webinars that were basically a pitch, I went, right, I'm going to go 3 hours and it's going to be 99% content and value and very little pitch. When I suppose podcasts are becoming more and more popular, but the way I launched my podcast was actually making the podcast launch more like a live event, because that's what I've done successfully over the years. In a climate now where no one's running live events, and I'm hearing leaders in our industry say things like live events are dead, they're never coming back, people are too scared to come. I'm like, that might be true in some cases, but what I'm seeing is that somewhere between 30 and 50% of our market are dying to get out to live events and meet people.
Yes.
And I'm just going to serve that 30 to 50% like no one else is, which seems to be working pretty well. So yeah, my final thought would be, look around you in your industry, look at what everyone else is doing, observe the masses, do the opposite.
That is awesome advice, Nick. Thank you so much. This has been, you're just a wealth of knowledge. It's been fantastic. But before I let you go for the day, where can people find you, your podcast, your live events? Yeah, cool. So I suppose 2 best places to find me, learn more, hear more about what we do and events we might have coming up. One would be to join our Facebook community. It's free. Georgia, I think you're part of that community. It's called the Expert Empires Community. So just go onto Facebook and search Expert Empires Community. We'll pop up, request to join the group, and one of my team will approve your request. And then the second thing is to subscribe and tune into the Empire Builders podcast. So search on any of the podcast platforms. Most people use Apple. Search Empire Builders podcast. And we've got, similar to you actually, Georgia, we've been going about 3 months. I think we've just launched our 20th episode. So there's about 20 episodes, probably 10, 15 hours worth of content on there that I've created over the last few months. A lot of it's topical and relevant right now, of course, given the current climate. So subscribe to the Empire Builders podcast, join the Expert Empires Community Facebook group, and we'll keep you up to date with what we've got going on. That is amazing. Thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate your time today and all of your insights.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.